So there is this story that's been bouncing around in the collective psyche of the Western world for a couple of thousand years. It's a story about an old man plodding along slowly behind a plow somewhere in the remote Italian countryside. This old man has a patch of dirt to call his own, but not a whole lot more. Although the story tells us that at one time, this same man had had very nearly everything. You see, the guy came from old money. He was the very definition of the patrician class. His family went back generations at the center of power, and he was raised to stay right there in that center of power for as long as he could hold on to it. And so the story tells us that in his prime, that man behind the plow had been a statesman. He had been a senator among senators. He had climbed the ladder of military and civic authority like people from old money often do, and he sat at the top of that ladder with great pride and expectation. And then the story tells us that it all went sideways real fast. He picked the wrong party in a major political horse race. His adult children made some really bad choices. The law somehow got involved, and in seemingly no time at all, authorities came and confiscated that man's property and his titles. And he sold almost everything to keep his kid out of jail and shirts on their backs. And his political fortunes fell in one giant sweep. And the man got out of the city. He picked up a plow on that patch of dirt in the country, and he tried to make it through every day outside of the game of power and authority. Until one day, leaders from the city, they came out to the country to find him. The republic was crumbling, they said. Everything they had fought for and believed in was at risk, and all of the real leaders had been driven out of the city, and there were no movers and no shakers left to stand in the center of the storm and to move the broken things, to shake the trees that needed shaking. There were no leaders left, the people said. And so they came out from the city, out to his farm, and they found the old man at the plow who had once led them. "Is everything okay?" he asked when he saw them, his old friends. And they told him nothing was okay. Invasion threatened, war loomed, everything they valued was crumbling. They needed him, they said, to come back once more into the fray, to come back, to do it anyway, though he did not want to. They needed him even though nothing had gone as planned, even though he was not perfect and his story was not even inspirational because no one else was leading. They needed him, they said. So legend says that this man, the Roman politician and military strategist named Cincinnatus, he put down the plow. He asked his wife to bring down his good senatorial toga with the purple lining, and he stepped up to assume the entire authority of the Roman Republic onto his own shoulders and all of the demands that entailed, because apparently no one else was leading. Leaving his plow right there in the middle of the field, Cincinnatus went off into the fray and proceeded to swiftly deal with the emergency in front of the people. He put an end to the looming war, defeated all the enemies, yada, yada, yada. And when the last sword had been crossed, he took his toga off, resigned his commission and all the power that came with it, and walked right off that battlefield all the way back to his farm in the country, where he picked up the plow still sitting in the row where he had left it 16 days before. 16 days of ultimate power, the pure relinquishing of it at the end. Leadership, when leadership was called for, peace at the end, and long, long days outside the shadow of leadership's demands. History remembers Cincinnatus as a shining example of statecraft, of what it means to be a leader. High school textbooks call him the prototype for George Washington, the quintessential American statesman, voluntarily relinquishing the reins of power, leading only so long as the call to do so was pure and clear and unblemished by selfish motivations. The lovely Midwestern city I went to college in bears his name, Cincinnati, Cincinnatus. The reluctant statesman who had the power lost it and let it go once he gained it again. And ever since his time, the Western world has romanticized the idea of the reluctant leader, the one who isn't in it for power, the one who takes up the task not because of ambition or ego, nor even because they are perfect or unblemished by their own history, but because of something that smacks of duty. Yes, for the entire history of the Western world, this is what we have said a leader is. We proclaim that this is the ideal for a resilient and effective society, the leader who doesn't really want to lead, the powerful one who holds on only long enough to be of service to the people and lets it go before, as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is a story we tell about what it takes to lead in fragile and complicated times, even while we repeatedly elect and support leaders who do the exact opposite. That kind of leader, the one who wears the mantle of leadership with some discomfort, it is an ideal that most of the world has espoused for a couple of millennia. Sometime even before Cincinnatus and his plow, people have spoken of these leaders. Before Scripture became Scripture, before the Torah turned into a book, there was nary a Hebrew prophet who did not take up the mantle of leadership and the burden of all of its effort with great reluctance. In fact, there was nary a Hebrew prophet who didn't flat out run away from his call in one way or another. Likewise, there are hardly any great scriptural truth tellers who didn't turn out in some way to be fundamentally inadequate to their own call, and who didn't end up wrestling out the act of saying yes anyway, in spite of it all. When you look at their stories, none of the prophets of the world's great religious traditions seemed destined to lead, or were frankly all that keen on holding the leadership once they got it. Moses had a stutter so bad that he could barely speak out loud in public. In fact, he was brought to his knees by the sheer effort and demand of speaking prophetic words out loud to people of power. And so Moses himself, he begged God to take that mantle of leadership from him. He begged God to give it to anyone. Most especially, he said, "How about my brother? He's a lot smarter than me." In fact, it was Moses' brother Aaron who served as Moses' translator, and the greatest prophet of them all was resilient enough to answer his call, not because he was so perfect or so amazing, but because he never ever went about the act of prophecy alone. And Elijah, who might be my favorite of the Hebrew prophets, Elijah, who we just sang about, standing on that rock, proclaiming the wisdom of the Lord, shouting in the face of the prophets of false gods. That Elijah, before he ended up on that rock, he was such a pain in the neck in his own community that the people chased him out of town, and he found himself hiding in a cave, cowering with his head over his hands over his head. The picture you have at the front of your order of service, that is Elijah in the state in which God found him, hiding in a cave, saying, "Don't let them find me, God. Do not let them find me, for surely they will force me to lead again." God had to command Elijah to get up out of that cave and go about his wisdom and stand on a rock and say anything true. Jonah was given a call to go forward and speak truth to a broken city and its corrupt leaders. But he knew that if he answered that call, everything he had ever known was at risk. So that prophet stole away on board a ship in the middle of the night, hoping to find himself so far off in the middle of nowhere that God and the broken cities and the demands of leadership couldn't find him. And you know how that whole thing worked out. Our stubborn saint got swallowed up by a whale and barfed up on the shores of the exact same broken city he had been avoiding so long. That's how that went. And that's the way it works for prophets. They are halting and afraid, reluctant, stubborn, sometimes altogether unfit for the immensity of the tasks before them. Sometimes they are too fragile and do not yet have the strength that is required to make it through the next hard thing. But still, in story after story, in faith tradition after faith tradition, the stubborn saints and the reluctant prophets find a way to answer their callings, even if the raw material they were given to answer that calling with feels anything but adequate. That's the sermon I'm actually preaching today. But just for a moment, because I would be so mad at myself if I didn't, I'm going to do something that I would advise against to any of my students of preaching that I teach, something that is really bad advice, and I'm going to use a few paragraphs to actually entirely contradict myself because it feels important. I need to note that archetype of the stubborn saints, of the men who run away from their calling, of the reluctant prophet, it is always just that, men. I need to say that because to not say it would keep me up at night. In the scriptures and beyond, it is always the men who run away from their calls. Jesus begged, "Lord, let this cup pass away from me." The Buddha didn't want to teach in public because he was certain no one could possibly understand the depth of the wisdom that he had to preach. Yes, all of the reluctant prophets, the stubborn saints, lifted up prominently in the Western tradition and beyond are men. And it is a decidedly gendered archetype, the reluctant leader who does it anyway. Time and again, when the women in the Hebrew, Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu scriptures throughout history are given a calling or a task that seems almost impossible, do you know time and time again what they do? They say, yes. And I'm not beating up on anybody's gender. I don't even believe in the gender binary anyway. I'm just saying that when Mary was told to somehow carry God around in her own body, she said, "Let it be done to me according to your word." And when Muhammad's wife, Khadijah, received her own revelation, which indicated it was her job to keep the prophet from being his own worst enemy, she signed right up. And when the Hebrew princess Esther was told that she would literally be killed if she went into the halls of power unsummoned to speak the truth of her own story, she did it anyway, and she saved her people when no one else could, because nothing could break her resolve, not even the surety of death. I am just saying, the stubborn saints, the reluctant leaders, in the stories we tell across the ages, they are mostly men. And in those same stories and in those same traditions, the archetype is different for women, because in every single story, the woman just says yes, either because her resilience comes from a different source or because so much has already been taken from her that she has nothing left to lose, or because the male God doesn't give her a choice in the first place. But that is a sermon for another day. I'm just saying. Back to our regularly scheduled sermon. My point is actually the opposite. Today I gave myself the job of playing with this repeated archetypal theme of those who are resisting the call, who are reluctantly accepting it, who are running away from it. So come back with me to the sermon I'm supposed to preach, the point of which is simply this: that if you look at the sheer frequency of these stories, you see that there is something about a calling. Throughout time and history, there is something about a calling that causes even the most faithful and capable among us to want to run the other way. to want to hide out till the calling passes by, to pray that the cup we are given might be taken from our lips and handed off to someone, maybe anyone else. There is something in a calling that leaves us wondering if we are too fragile to say yes, looking over our shoulders for someone else, perhaps someone better equipped, more resilient, for someone ready for the task when surely we ourselves are not. There is something in the stories that we tell and the lives that we lead that causes us to imagine there was someone else to do what must be done and someone else to step into the impossible moment that we ourselves are moving toward. When I was a teenager and a young adult, in fact, for most of my life, before I was a regularly preaching minister, I was a competitive swimmer. That was the thing I did before I did this. And I was scrappy and hardworking and strong. But I was maybe 3 inches too short to be great, and I was never graceful enough to be elegant. We used to call me the headbanger because I would literally slam my face into the water with every single stroke and come up looking like I'd been smacked in the forehead. I was many things, but I was not graceful. And I remember all those years looking at the girls who somehow in my head were born with gifts I didn't have, of grace, of stature, of strength. I remember looking at them and thinking, I was just not made for this. And I remember how that thought made me feel. Paradoxically, not bad, but relieved. It was a way to sneak around my anxiety and tell me that being just fine was just fine enough. Surely I am not made for this, I thought. Surely those other taller, stronger people are, and surely under such circumstances, this whole thing does not matter that much, really, does it? And perhaps it didn't. But what about when the stakes cannot be lowered? What about when it's not an artificial contest or a battle of wills, but the living of our lives and the capacity to hold together what is most dear and precious to our hearts, our households, our nations, and our world? What if the republic is at risk and all of us keep looking over our shoulders for some other people, stronger, wiser, somewhere else who can step into the task of saving it? What if there are no other roads but the road we are on together, no other powers but the powers we hold in our hands? What if we were made for this, just as we are, and no better, no smarter, no taller, no stronger, no wiser, no more perfect? What if we were made for these times in our lives, in our nation, in our world? And what if the call is not going away, no matter how much we try to run away from it, no matter how much we want to hide out and imagine that the work is for someone braver? So we ask all the same old questions. Are we ourselves not too foolish to posit answers to the biggest questions? Are we not too exhausted to tip at the windmills of the system when we've been doing it for decades already? Are we not weaker and less graceful than those ones we'd hoped would come along to save us? And here's the thing, though, that most of the lauded prophets and saints of history acted like fools at one point or another. Almost all of them declared at one point or another that they were not made for this. Almost all of the ones whom history has lifted up as the greatest leaders of their age wondered at some point if the one they were waiting for was somebody else. All of them thought that surely the demand placed on them, whatever it was, the demand to lead, to live, to survive, to make a difference, to go head on at whatever it is we face, is a call we ourselves were not made for. And story after story of the stubborn saints confronted with a persistent call rises up to our eyes. Cincinnatus left his plow. Elijah eventually got up out of that cave. Moses spoke right through his stutter. Siddhartha the Buddha got over his need to be understood and said true things out loud to people, whether they got his point or not. At some point in our lives, maybe many points, we have all been called called to be leaders in our own personal, professional, and congregational lives, called to step away from what feels in our guts to be wrong and to carry on, to begin anew. All of those callings begin as ideas. Ideas to which we human beings are capable of saying yes, and by counterpoint, capable of refusing over and over again. I heard an accomplished mentor of mine once say that much of her life has been a process of saying yes. The callings come. They come from within and without. The callings pour out upon us, not upon better people, not upon more perfect ones, not on ones more willing or more fearless, but on us. The ones we have been waiting for are right here. The stubborn saints and the reluctant leaders. The ones who look over our shoulders and find no one there but each other, inviting us to say yes, to step out of the safety of our silence, and to discover just where this call might lead.